Has the world gone mad? Are you perhaps losing your mind? Are you in a relationship with someone who has a mental illness? These are the topics that I want to explore today. Insanity and sanity are words that are kind of difficult to define. We do spend a lot of time talking about mental health and mental illnesses and identifying this particular brand of mental illness and this other particular brand of personality disorder. And we devote a lot of time, to exploring that entire realm of not really mental health, but mental unhealth. And we don't really, how can we really even understand what that unhealth is without really understanding what health is? What is sanity? If you sit down and try to think about it, it can take you down a really weird path. And you find out a lot of things in the realm of mental health and unhealth can become very relative pretty quickly. There is a pretty good definition that I'd like to put forth. And this isn't really my idea. This is pretty conventional, but I think we've just forgotten how to look at things simply because we've gotten caught up in the weeds and all the words that describe this particular illness and this other particular illness. The health industry tends to break things up into compartments and pieces, and it thinks about the human body like a spreadsheet of columns with symptoms and rows with different parts of the body or different parts of your personality or your behavior. And unfortunately, that is a very atomized way of viewing the human ecosystem. Everything is much more holistic. Everything is much more interconnected. But here's a good way to look at it. Insanity is often something that we associate with people who are just kind of out of their mind, which is actually the wrong term. They're actually in their mind is really what's going on. So if you go to an insane asylum, you'll find people who are paranoid about somebody over there is out to get them, or they believe that they were abducted by aliens and the aliens are coming back and they're going to take them, and or they believe the CIA is actually keeping an eye on them and spying on them. These are symptoms of not really being out of your mind. It's a symptom of living inside of your head, inside of a story, a narrative that has sort of taken root in that person's perception of the world. And then on the opposite side of that spectrum, we go from insanity, which is what I just described, all the way to sanity, which would be truly being out of your mind and therefore being in the world, being grounded in reality, and not really taking any action or reaction other than to stimuli that is real versus imaginary. So that is a very basic way of describing the spectrum between sanity and insanity. And the truth is, the reason why this is such a difficult topic to explore is that there's no single individual who is 100% sane. We are all somewhere on that spectrum. And of course, we want to strive toward sanity, right? We want to move toward being more awake and more alert and more perceptive, truly perceptive of the real world. However, humanity has been going down this path of making it easier and easier and easier for people to avoid reality, for people to isolate themselves from the real world. At a basic level, you can think about homes and heating systems as a fundamental way of trying to avoid the harshness of nature, and all the other technological advancements that we've made, from airplanes that allow us to fly, which is completely unreal if you think about it. I'm not placing any judgment on these things. I'm just saying that the trajectory has been toward making it harder and harder and harder for human beings to be perceptive of the real world, and easier and easier and easier for people to project what's going on in here into the real world, thereby becoming crazy, thereby becoming more insane. So I think that's a good place to start. It also gives you a method by which you can test yourself and figure out how insane you are and how much closer to sanity you need to become. So on a day-to-day basis, if you can take account of the moments in which you find yourself projecting something into the external world that was born in here, try to catch yourself in those moments and try to prune away those bad habits. Carl Jung talked about this idea of individuation as this phenomena of a human being sort of waking up to their true identity and true individual sovereignty as they aged, as they got older. And he described it as this process of when you're flung into the real world has a way of creating friction, like a grinding friction against things that were in your head throughout your childhood, and prune those things away, shed it. It helps you, reality sort of helps you shed these accoutrements that you've accumulated over the years. And until you get to a point where you can see clearly the world and yourself and your place in it without any sort of false delusions. And that is sort of the process of individuation. There's also the concept of the constellation of the self, which is something that happens at a much earlier age. And that's where you develop a kind of a sense of person, a sense of individuality. This happens when you're like 2 or 3, assuming you have a healthy, stable upbringing. Constellation is something that I like to describe in this way. When you're born, and the reason I'm kind of taking this tangent is because the path between insanity and sanity is also one that takes place as we age, as we grow up. So children are largely insane, not when viewed within the context of them being a child, because that hyperactive imagination, those irrational fears are normal. But if the child grows up and takes these irrational mental habits with them and doesn't shed them in the process of confronting the real world, then those things can sort of take root in the mind, and they figure out a way. Your brain is incredible, because it'll figure out a way of integrating those irrational fears with reality so that they become almost impossible to shed. And that's when you start to allow essentially insanity, true insanity, to take root. And the further that develops in your brain, the more likely you are to have to be locked up. I mean, at that level of you can really go down that path. And so it's incredibly important to become very vigilant and attentive of your mental habits and what your mind is how your mind is perceiving the world, especially when it does it erroneously. I'm sure there's many times you've had a suspicion of something, or a fear that this might happen, and then it didn't. And in that moment, you could choose to be like, oh, I guess this habit that I have in my mind of believing that this thing might happen is actually wrong. Or you can deny that moment and make an exception for it and be like, oh, it's a trick. They're trying to convince me, these ghosts or these aliens are trying to convince me that I'm going crazy, right? That sort of mental gymnastic that you might take in order to avoid yourself from confronting reality is supremely toxic and bad for you, bad for your mental health. But anyway, a child has these qualities naturally, has these insane qualities naturally. And then as they grow older, hopefully they shed them when they confront the real world. And so the best thing you can do for anybody's mental health is do absolutely nothing to isolate them from the real world when they're old enough to take care of themselves. So back to this idea of the constellation of the self, which happens at an early age. I like to describe that as if we saw each person as a mirror when they're born, as a perfectly pristine mirror, whose role was really just to reflect the world, is really descriptive of babies. If you smile at a baby, the baby will smile back at you. If you frown and you're sad, the baby might even cry. Babies have naturally this sort of reflexive empathy. And so they largely mirror and reflect what is going on around them. And that is also true to an extent, of course. As they grow up, they imitate their parents, and the words, their vocabulary becomes the words and the vocabulary you use around them or expose them to. There's a lot of imitation that is natural to us as human beings. But that child is an individual. They're not a copy of you. They are an entity that is unique, that has a unique package of genetic information. And they may be completely different from either parent as they grow up and they grow older. But before that happens, they develop a sense of self and a sense of independence, and they start saying no to things, and they want to do their own things, and they have their own ideas, and this is healthy, of course. This is all part of the normal development of a child. But if that child is encountered with a lack of stability, where things suddenly disappear, maybe a family member, the mother or the father leaves them, or they die, or you have to move all of a sudden from one place to another, and the room that they were used to is no longer there. Anything that would involve a lack of stability for a child can prevent the child from individuating. And this process of individuating I describe as stickers being placed on top of this mirror that each individual is. This pristine mirror that we all are when we're born gets decorated with memories, with experiences, hopefully all positive in some way, or at least not negative or traumatic. And over time, as the child grows up, this mirror becomes completely covered up with a very unique and colorful arrangement of these stickers, which again are memories, experiences, and that the resulting artwork, this resulting collage of a person, is the constellated individual. This is my perspective on it. And largely why each one of us is very unique and very different, and we have different personalities, different experiences. We also have all the unique genetic combinations that make us different from each other. And so all these things combined make us this unique character, this unique person that goes through the world trying to fit in as best they can. And this is all part of the healthy development of a person. What happens then as that person grows older and ages is you start to realize that these stickers aren't really you. They're not really the real you. What happens as you get older is you become more introspective and you really want to understand yourself a little deeper. And maybe you go to therapy to do that. Maybe you take on meditation or some sort of religious practice. It's very common. This is a very healthy part of human development. And what that would look like is these stickers just one by one being peeled off and peeled off and peeled off, and give yourself complete access to this pristine mirror that was underneath all along. This beautiful reflection of the world. It's truly what we are. We're a fractal representation of the divine once you get down to the real you. And so if you're able to clear out the mirror completely and get rid of all the stickers, that's what we might call being in a state of enlightenment. It's something that is rarely ever achieved. And largely because if you were to achieve it, you become someone who doesn't really belong in the real world anymore. And the world will largely view you as being insane. And so finding that balance is pretty tricky. But the beauty of being able to go through that journey completely of accumulation and then letting go, becoming enlightened, getting lighter of all those things, is you get to experience the complete spectrum of human experience. What happens with kids who don't properly constellate and because they experienced abandonment or loss or a lack of stability in their early years, is they end up developing a mirror that is very slippery and things don't stick to it. You don't form a bond with a toy that is given to you because part of you feels that it's going to be taken away, and so you decide not to form an attachment. A new person comes into your life. Okay, they're in my life, but I'm not attaching myself to them. You have a new experience, even if it's something great that happens. You dismiss it and don't develop any bond with that. These are perhaps healthy habits for an adult to develop, but not necessarily for a child. Because what happens is that child never properly constellates and develops a sense of person, which you need. You fundamentally need to have a sense of personhood in order to move your way through the world in a healthy way that is productive and functioning. The path to making the world a less insane place begins with us looking at ourselves and and making ourselves more sane. I've mentioned before this phenomena of things representing themselves fractally in the real world. So, for example, if you look at a leaf, you can see within the leaf a pattern that looks very similar, in some cases identical, to the pattern of the trunk and its branches. If you look at a human being with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a neck and head, it's very similar to how our hands look. We have 2 long fingers, 2 medium length fingers, and a short finger. Everything manifests from inside to the outside. And so in order to change the world, it's a cliche, but in order to change the world, you need to change yourself. And so I think these ideas are hopefully useful to you in your path of achieving better mental health for yourself. But if you're a parent of a child, also an understanding of why it's incredibly important for you to give that child as much stability and consistency as possible. I think if we improve ourselves, and if you're a parent, hopefully you have improved yourself to a large extent already, but it's especially important as a parent to be aware of the important role you play in the mental health of your own child. The future largely rests on how those children will grow up to be. And so as a parent, you need to strike a balance of providing stability and constancy and protection, and also letting your child experience the real world and deal with reality in measures that are commensurate with their level of development. You know, it's interesting, this whole idea of fractal representations. I also noticed that the stages of growth that we go through as an individual, from child to adulthood, is really similar to the stages that humanity itself has gone through over all the different eras and epochs. So, like an infant, for example, who is very vulnerable and prone to making a lot of error, is very similar to humanity during the prehistoric era. And as that infant becomes a child and is able to move around and manipulate external matter, that would be like the Neolithic era or the Stone Age, where still a lot of mistakes and a lot of tinkering and a lot of exploration and there's a lot of chaos still. And then as that child grows up and becomes a youth that is now smart enough to be able to actually create things and manipulate things in a more fine way, is like when we were going through the Middle Ages and we had a very hyperactive imagination as a species, just like a child does. They largely live in their heads and they have all sorts of ideas, irrational thoughts and fears. And the Middle Ages was definitely a time that was like that. All sorts of religious ideas and sects and tribes and empires and conquests. And then when that youth goes through puberty and early adulthood, when they're 18 years of age, and they are largely driven by their own reproductive impulses, that would be like the era that is kind of ending right now. And I think the era we are about to go into is that of humanity finally realizing that the real world is has consequences, that certain actions have real world consequences. I think humanity for the past couple hundred years has been like the teenager who decided to have a party while mom and dad were out on a trip, and take the car out on a joyride without permission from the parents, and basically caused a lot of chaos in the process. And so all of the people who have really been driving our society, and tinkering and playing around thinking that they could get away with a lot of stuff, are now realizing, whoops, that was a mistake. And reality is hitting them. Now, unfortunately, this person that is the human species has a lot of arrogance and a lot of narcissism. And if you catch someone like that in the act of making a mistake, these kinds of individuals are apt to deny it, or to have outbursts of anger, or double down on their actions, in order to refuse to allow reality to have a confrontation with their own actions. And that just means that reality will continue to brush up against us. And if we continue to make the same mistakes, there is no escaping truth. There is no escaping the real world. And so one way or another, we are going to grow up. And I think that is cause for optimism. I think that is cause for looking to the future in an optimistic way, because it means that our best years are still ahead. But we each have to do our part, investigating our own character and our own flaws. Because the accumulation of that, if we all did that, and we also took care of our children's mental health, then all of humanity would become healthier in the process as well. All it takes is one generation. All it takes is 20 years to completely change the world. And I thought that was a message worth sharing. If you agree or disagree or have something to add, please share it in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.